two things that have been in the news lately are this tragic shooting of 17 kids in some Florida high school. And like firing a rifle on the south side of a herd of cattle, the American people are running straight north. And in terms of Hegelian dialectic, the best way to create a mass movement is to give them a problem that needs to be solved. And this has been going on for a long time, well before the United States was established. And there's very little doubt in the minds of people who have looked at the evidence. The Patriot Act was sitting on somebody's desk well before 9/11 took place. It's a very complicated document, quite thick, and in addition to its size, the way the Patriot Act is worded is it refers to this clause being removed from this sentence in this paragraph on this page. So there was a great deal of interaction between writing the Patriot Act as a law and the research into previous laws relating to citizens' rights and citizens' protections. Second reality, any power that you give to a government, a very benign, beneficent government, will be abused when that government goes through a cycle of being malignant and evil. The founders of the company, I'm right there, but I don't want to say it that way. The founders of the nation knew that, so they intended to build in checks and balances in the Constitution. When Benjamin Franklin was asked, what kind of government have you given us after the Constitutional Convention? Mr. Franklin said, a republic, if you can keep it. Because in the debates about the Constitution, it was widely recognized that you had a balance of competing forces, and one of those major balances was between people with property and people without property. Now, the Constitution was written by men exclusively of property. They all took the summer off in 1787 to write the Constitution. You don't take the summer off if you're working as a day laborer, as a blacksmith. But there were competing interests even there. You had the southern plantation owners that were basically concerned about food and material production, and you had the northern people who were concerned about manufacturing. So you had competing interests, but they were competing economic interests. It was recognized by Madison, particularly, however, that the only way we're going to get this Constitution ratified is if we bring the people along. And they were candid to recognize they wanted to minimize the impact of the unproperty people, and they wanted to maximize the cooperation and involvement of the unproperty people. How do you do that? You give them the illusion that they're involved and reduce their actual power as much as possible. When the Constitution was first written, senators were elected by state representative assemblies. The president was elected by representative assemblies. And the representatives in the House of Representatives was elected by propertied citizens of the states. Virtually every state in the Union at that time had property requirements before you could vote. So not only were women and blacks excluded, but indentured servants were excluded, and day laborers and people who labored for their bread and butter without having property. You had to own property, and in some cases a substantial amount of property, simply to have the right to vote. The point that I'm making is that in all of these cases, it was recognized that the wealthy needed to have protections against seizure of their property by the people who didn't have property. One of the slogans of the people who actually make decisions in every country, and in particular this, is never let a good crisis go to waste. I mentioned this Patriot Act. You had the National Defense Authorization Acts 1 and 2, both of which were oriented toward guaranteeing the perpetuation of the powers of the Patriot Act. Right now, in terms of legal sense, Donald Trump could legally send a missile to take out this room. Now, he might have a little trouble explaining it to the Iowa City Press Citizen, but in terms of the legal authority to execute an American citizen on American soil, he's got it. Now, 99.99% of Americans don't know that, because like Nazi Germany, 99.99% of the American public has not come under the scrutiny of the security state. People who come under the scrutiny of the security state are extremist elements. Now, we've been told that they are ultranational white supremacists. That's what you and I have been told. I think, apart from those nationalistic elements that have been fostered by the propertied state, that white nationalists have been 1% of the American population in 1890, 1% of the American population in 1930, and 1% of the American population in 2018. And a lot of the rest of us have been lumped in that category by people who are lumping people into box A, B, C, and D. In fact, in the last roughly 15 years, the primary meme or pattern of population manipulation is you are a member of one group, and you are a member of another group, and you are a member of another group. And if you're not against a member of that group, there's something wrong with you, because obviously their interests conflict with your interests. Right now we have, let's see, transgenders, gays, feminists, white supremacists, blacks, black females. Somebody help me out. We've got some other categories there too. And if you're not part of this group, then you're part of that group.
We have vegans.
Pardon?
We have vegans and we have meat eaters.
Vegans versus those terrible carnivores. And there's even an advertisement so that you can experiment with insectivores out here on the... So, yes. And I want, somewhere along the line, I'm going to remind my son, who is an avid deer hunter, that one of his favorite heroes, Mr. Rogers, said famously, "I don't want to eat anything that has a mother." Now, I don't happen to be a vegetarian, but I still think it's, I think Fred Rogers had a very valid point there. But in any case, the meme of American manipulation of the public for the last 15 years has been identity politics. And in the process of identity politics, I happen to be a member of the only minority that does not have legal protections. Legal protections are not afforded white, male, heterosexuals. We're the only ones that don't have any legal protections. I feel like an oppressed minority. The point that I am making, however, quite seriously about the issue of gun so-called violence is that it is a perfect way of manipulating the public to do something that the ruling elites want to accomplish. Now, did they want to accomplish gun registration? Their ultimate goal is to put people who want to own and or use guns outside that Maginot line. It's another way of creating insiders and outsiders. And you'll remember that I described the Maginot line as that line between people who think rightly and people who think wrongly. There are a host of ways of drawing that Maginot line. Indeed, I want to point out that in the United States for easily the last 50 or 60 years, and progressively in the last 20 years, American cultural evolution has been experiencing a pressure that far exceeds natural cultural evolution. Natural cultural evolution does change. I mean, the cultural evolution does take place, but it takes place slowly, as, for example, when some dear friends of mine in Florida who were avid gay bashers discovered that one of their offspring was homosexual. His and her attitudes changed very rapidly because they became aware of what homosexuality meant to their offspring, how important their offspring were to them, and therefore what they wanted to initiate in terms of changing American society. A perfectly natural, appropriate cultural evolution. But you and I have been subjected to a media onslaught that is not only about heterosexuality versus homosexuality, but transgender identification, embracing of a host of what would ordinarily be called cultural aberrations. We have been told by our media, from whence we get our instructions as what it means for us to be American, we have been told by our media that we ought to have no restrictions on any form of behavior. Now, from a cultural evolutionary point of view, that is A, absurd, and B, pressure from above, not a natural evolution such as my friend experienced in Florida. Last and not least about gun violence and the way our culture and our cultural media has exploited it is Heinz Kissinger's comment. And I intentionally misuse his first name because he has a background of Prussian thinking. Kissinger said, "We can create the conditions where the American people will not tolerate martial law. They will demand it." And in that very same vein, with enough mass shootings, at least a certain percentage of which are engineered, certain groups can create the conditions where Americans will voluntarily give up all of their rights, and we have functionally given up our rights. We just don't know that they have been taken from us. Perhaps the only constitutional amendment of the Bill of Rights that still exists is the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. And it's worth pointing out, when that was written in 1787, every male adult, for all practical purposes, had a weapon and knew how to use it, and it was a weapon comparable to the military they were facing, which was one of the major reasons that the revolutionaries won the Revolutionary War. Now, there are a lot of political reasons in addition, not the least of which the French came in and gave us a real great hand at whatever that last battle was. So there were profound political reasons why the revolutionaries won their battle. But the fact that they were able to recruit an army, and even recruit an army out of people who didn't have the right to vote, had to do with that population owning and being able to use a weapon. So I am very disappointed in the lack of intelligence of our American citizenry, because they're responding exactly the way they are supposed to, as a herd of sheep rather than a herd of human beings. That's on the matter of the shooting of the 17 kids in Florida, which was a tragedy and has been exploited very effectively by people who want to exploit it. Questions? Comments? Well, Dawn.
Well, if you say that the weapons in the homes are equivalent of military weapons available now, there are so many powerful weapons that our government has, I don't see how any person could afford it. I'm thinking about the kinds that disrupt waves, sound waves.
Oh, you're absolutely, in terms of technology, you're absolutely correct. There's no way we can. And I'm not even suggesting that Americans be armed with rapid-fire weapons. What I am saying is that it is my opinion and the opinion of a substantial proportion of our population that our government is no longer our protector, but is our enemy in a host of circumstances. Okay? Now I'm going to let that sink in, because as long as you perceive the cop on the beat as your friend, you have one attitude towards him. But if Demita were here, I would ask her, do you perceive the cop on the beat, who, or especially the cop in his anti-riot gear, do you perceive that individual as your friend and protector, or do you perceive him as your oppressor who is at risk of robbing you of life and limb? I picked Amita because she happens to be African American. The vast majority of white Americans do not yet appreciate the cop on the beat in that fashion. But if you ask the 99 percenters who were part of, what was that movement?
Occupy.
Occupy. Would those young people consider the cop on the beat their protector or their enemy? Consider the kids who were rousted out of that park in New York at 3 o'clock in the morning with their property being smashed, their computers being smashed, and the kids being arrested after being billy clubbed. And at least some of those white kids would no longer consider the cop as their protector. And when you look at, when you read John Whitehead, who's the director of the Rutherford Institute. John Whitehead is a lawyer who's been active in civil rights protection activities, and he documents up one side and down the other how the protections that have been afforded us by the Constitution have been stripped away. Now, they may have been stripped away in New Mexico, or in Oregon, or in Washington State. But what takes place in New Mexico, or Oregon, and Washington State will metastasize from the outside in. It takes place where you have cultural conflict, but it metastasizes in where you have cultural uniformity. I had reflected momentarily earlier on as to how to start this discussion this afternoon. And I personally feel like a German citizen about 1937 who had not been seduced by the Nazi Party. Because remember, in 1933, the Nazi Party was elected by a minority. Hitler came to power in a coalition government. And very effectively, he eliminated the power of his coalition partners and was granted dictatorial powers legally by the German elected body. But that he came about as a minority party achieving dictatorship powers by the representative body vote. And in 1937, there was a military parade that took place in Berlin. Hitler was showing off his new military to the citizenry of Berlin. And they were standing, the people were standing on the side of the road, glum. They were sick and tired of military and militarism. They had lost, even though they had not had foreign armies on German soil, they had lost both in terms of treasure and in terms of population greatly in World War I. And although they may have had political differences with France and with England and with Russia, they didn't want any war. So they were glum on the sides of the road. And Hitler, seeing the lack of enthusiasm in his citizenry, turned to one of his aides and said, "How can you go to war with people with this kind of enthusiasm?" So the Nazi Party may have been cheering at the Nuremberg Stadium, but not all the German people were cheering. And even in the German military, a whole lot of Germans were in the German army because they were Germans, not because they were Nazis. Dietrich Bonhoeffer's brother, who certainly was not a Nazi, was in the army defending Germany. So to paint Germans with the same brush that you paint members of the Nazi Party is simply inappropriate. And on the subject of the Nazi Party, I'm going to mention a phenomenon that Catherine Austin Fitts calls attention to and needs to be appreciated. Catherine Austin Fitts used to work on Wall Street. She worked at Dillon Read and Company. And it was her astute observation, because she was not blind sociologically or to the financial manipulations. Her astute observation that almost all of the people she worked with and dealt with on Wall Street were good, decent people. Now that's hard to believe, knowing what Wall Street has degenerated to in terms of robbing the American population blind. But the vast majority of them had simply decided to go along to get along. An absolutely destructive philosophy, but one with which I am in considerable sympathy. If you look at the situation today, how could a journalist work for the Washington Post or the New York Times, or for that matter, National Public Radio, and speak what I perceive to be the truth and what a lot of people who look at the data perceive to be the truth? They wouldn't last a week. It's not a matter of a conspiracy. It's a matter that the only way you ascend up the ladder of success in American corporate business today is by going along to get along. The original thinker, out. The critic of the way things are is out. So the guy who comes up to the captain's booth on the Titanic and says, "Captain, there's an iceberg straight ahead," is not rewarded. He's sent down to the brig. So, any other questions or comments? I wish it weren't so, but I'll tell you a little story. When I was having the surgery done, my surgeon was the head of the Department of Ophthalmology, very nice guy, an African American. And he asked me what class I taught at the senior center. And I said, all the things your teacher didn't tell you. So not even particularly trying to start a conversation, I asked him if he was familiar with Howard Zinn. And I mentioned the title of Howard's most important book, A People's History of the United States, and described it as history as depicted by the losers rather than the winners, by the women, by the indentured servants, by the black slaves, by the American Indian. You know what? You know what happened to the conversation at that point? No further discussion. It simply was not a subject that polite society wanted to deal with. And I respect the guy. I respect the people who were also in the room assisting Dr. Carter. But you know what? There are just certain messages that many people don't want to hear because they don't want to have to intellectually deal with them. I may wish it weren't so, but it is so.
Well, I'm with you.
Pardon me?
I'm with you so far, except for the part about the guns. That's not gonna help me.
Well-
The gun, as a German citizen, if I identify as you did,
Oh, I'm not proposing any
having the guns
solution.
aren't gonna help me up against the guy in riot gear, or, I mean,
Yeah.
up against the type of government, which I agree, it was elected by a minority, isn't in power now, and have the Patriot Act and other such things to retain control. My gun isn't gonna help me with that. So the NRA, which in fact, as you talk about Parkview, you're sounding like the NRA folks that were at the.
You're trying to put me inside or outside. I'm teasing you.
I just, you know, I would try to say that in a nicer way, but then I would have to, you know,
Flower it up.
Yeah, sorry. But
I
they
am
were
not
on
proposing-
TV yesterday, and they were saying just, you know, similar things about the shooting. This is what the elite wants, you know, they want another school shooting, so they can, you know, manipulate you.
I want you,
When
lest,
you lose your guns, you lose everything.
lest I've been misunderstood, I have not proposed a solution to the use of guns in mass killings. I'm not even approached that. I'm pointing out the fallacies of the current approach to a solution. And it is a fallacy. And I fully admit that my 16 gauge shotgun is not going to stop the FBI from coming into my home if they choose to do so.
Right.
But with the number of guns in the United States in the hands of law-abiding citizens, that is an inhibitor of the exercise of the power of government over the citizenry. Will it stop it if they decide to? No. I fully admit that. But it is an inhibitor in the hopes that the American citizenry wake up and change things. I'm not optimistic, but I am hopeful that enough American citizens will say, hell no, we're not going to cooperate with this A, B, C, D, and E. Now she comes.
Hello.
Okay, the second item, and I might have to use the blackboard for this. And you might want to take notes because you won't get this on NPR or New York Times or the Washington Post. The more I listen to this so-called Russiagate story, the more surreal it becomes. So I want to give you a timeline as to what can be documented. And from time to time, you will see connections with what you have heard on the news. Between March of 2015, long before the election, and March of 2016, Hillary Clinton's private server in the basement of her home was hacked, and a bunch of emails were leaked to the press. And I don't think these were leaked via WikiLeaks. I think these came by a separate leaking mechanism. And it became clear that Ms. Clinton was incredibly careless with official documents, including documents that were classified secret or top secret. So in the year preceding the electoral season, it became obvious that Ms. Clinton was incredibly careless, okay? And that was a major political and legal problem for Hillary Clinton. In February of 2016, the beginning of the electoral season, New Hampshire held its primary, and a month thereafter, John Podesta's emails and Clinton's emails were leaked by WikiLeaks on March of 2016. Separately, and this may have been part and parcel with the leaks from her private server. I'm not certain of that. What I'm coming to, however, is that it was becoming progressively apparent, A, that Podesta and Clinton were behaving in a fashion toward the American people and towards their rivals in a fashion that was really disgusting. Two FBI officials, a Mr. Strzok and a Miss Page. Miss Page is a FBI lawyer, and Mr. Strzok was an FBI agent. Were having an affair, and they were exchanging messages via their FBI-issued phones. Incredibly stupid, but that's their stupidity. And they were discussing, Mr. Strzok was involved in investigating Hillary Clinton because she had been so careless with the classified documents. And Strzok said to Miss Page, you know, we've got to be careful here, because she may be our president. Basically saying, because she might be our president, we better go soft on her in terms of this investigation. And Miss Page agreed. About the same time, which is very interesting, about the same time, an employee at SIGINT, the agency responsible for spying on foreigners, came to Admiral Mike Rogers, who was in charge of the National Security Agency, and said, Admiral, there's something funny going on. Certain FBI agents and certain agents from the Department of Justice are looking at the secret documents. These secret documents that have been gathered on American citizens, not foreigners, but American citizens. They're not supposed to do that, but under certain circumstances, they do it. Moreover, Admiral, they've been sharing this with contractors, with private contractors, and I don't think this is right. Mike Rogers, to his great credit, looked into the matter, found out that what his agent had told him was true, and said, we're going to do an audit as to how this information has been used. He did the audit, found out that these two agencies, A, had been sharing information, and B, had been using that information as justification for seeking search warrants on at least one of Donald Trump's employees, one of Donald Trump's advisors. In other words, they had gotten wiretaps on one of Donald Trump's advisors by misusing information that they had acquired by sharing this information with an outside agency. They had broken the law. Members of the Obama's Department of Justice and members of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had misused their authority in looking at this data and sharing that data with a private contractor. One of those private contractors subsequently hired Daniel Steele, who was the author of the Steele dossier. In other words, they were looking for dirt on Donald Trump at or before March of 2016. Now that was at the beginning of the primary season. No one's ever asked, were they looking for dirt on Senator Cruz and some of the other people who were in the primary season? What we know is that they were looking for dirt on Donald Trump. But this was at the point in time where it was not at all clear that Trump was going to be the Republican candidate. So they were looking for dirt on him. So already we have crimes being committed by members of the Department of Justice, including Loretta Lynch, and by the head of the FBI, whatever his first name is, Comey, and several other people. Joe DeGeneva mentions this, and since we'll probably have time, we may get to that, and I'll replay Mr. Geneva's account. But this timeline is interesting because the audit that Mike Rogers did was about contemporaneous with them looking with Counter-Strike looking for dirt on Donald Trump. Somewhere around May, the Democratic National Committee says, we've been hacked. And their computer company said, we've been hacked and it looks like it was done by Russians. At which point, you would have expected the FBI would say, that's important, that's a foreign country hacking an American computer, we've got to investigate it, and we've got to look at that computer, and we've got to get all the data we can. You would think that would be a rational reaction of the FBI, wouldn't you? The FBI says they asked the DNC for access to the computer, and they were declined. The DNC says we offered it to them, and they declined. We have he said, she said. So we don't know what happened. We do know the FBI never investigated the DNC computer. In early July, Seth Rich, who was an employee at the Democratic National Committee, was murdered on the streets of Washington, D.C. A couple weeks thereafter, Julian Assange of WikiLeaks released a trove of information from the DNC computers and Hillary Clinton's emails. Immediately after that, a mysterious internet person calling him or herself Lucifer II said, I'm the person who leaked that to WikiLeaks, and I'm a Russian agent. Didn't say it quite that way, but he left a, a trail of breadcrumbs suggesting that he was a Russian agent. Fortunately for us, who are trying to reconstruct history, Lucifer II is a blind alley. Lucifer II took data directly from the DNC computer and leaked it sequentially, claiming this is what I leaked to WikiLeaks. Well, some of the stuff that Lucifer II leaked was in the WikiLeaks file, but it wasn't in the DNC computer. It was in Hillary Clinton's emails. So we haven't the biggest idea where it got it. The long and short of that message is, Lucifer II was released to the American public in order to substantiate the claim that Russians had hacked into the DNC computer. We don't know. Unless somebody with competence looks at the DNC computer for that first leak, we won't know who did it. The supposition, since Lucifer II was clearly a blind alley, is that after somebody stole documents from the DNC computer, somebody found out about it and decided to cover their tracks and created Lucifer II in order to act as a diversion from what actually came from the computers and introduced into WikiLeaks. Now, Julian Assange claims that the information he got did not come from Russians. And Craig Murray, who's a former diplomat for the British, claims that he was the intermediary between the supplier of the information from the DNC computer, and that he was the intermediary who delivered it to Julian Assange. And Mr. Murray also says, I didn't get it from a Russian. But until the FBI or somebody looks at the DNC computer, we will not know. Now, the way we know that the second download was not by a Russian, can't say this about the first one, but we can say it about the second one, is that Will Binney examined the electronic data and records that that was downloaded at a speed far in excess of what you can get via the internet. It was downloaded almost certainly by one of these USB memory chips, which can absorb data a whole lot faster than can be translated over the internet. Now, I cannot tell you that the Russians did not do the first hacking. I can tell you that Craig Murray knows the person who relayed it to him, and Craig Murray said it was not a Russian. Julian Assange, by contacting Craig Murray, has to have known who was giving the information to Craig Murray, and he says it wasn't a Russian. However, all of the American media says it was a Russian. I let you decide. Okay, that takes us up to fall of 2016. Mike Rogers knows by this time that FBI and Department of Justice people from Obama's administration had broken the law. And he makes this known to the FISA court, and the FISA court either writes the report and Rogers declassifies it, or Rogers himself wrote the report. The report says Department of Justice officials and FBI officials misused information, abused information by sharing it with private parties, and has revealed this information to the FISA court. That report exists. It's a 99-page report. It's been declassified. What is missing from that report, because it's been blanked out, are the names of the Department of Justice officials, the names of the FBI officials, and the names of the third-party contractors. But it's 99, if you want to read through the blanks, it's all there. Devin Nunes has that information without the blanks. And in the terms of some of the people who've been investigating this, Devin Nunes is a real hero. Paul Craig Roberts has written the report that nominating Devin Nunes for president and Ray McGovern as head of the CIA, which makes good sense because both of them have proven to be reputable, decent human beings, whether they'd ever get the opportunity for the office. I've shared with you that Strzok and Page have already decided to go easy on Hillary Clinton. Strzok changes the wording of a report that Comey himself wrote about Hillary Clinton's abuse of classified information. Comey's report called Clinton's behavior grossly negligent. By the way, by using the word negligent, that becomes a criminal offense. Strzok changed the wording to extremely careless, which is not in and of itself, by definition, a criminal offense. He's doing everything he can to protect his future president. But as Joe DeGenova said, the problem was she didn't become president. As soon as Donald Trump was elected, Mike Rogers went to Donald Trump and said, Mr. President-elect, this is what was done at the FISA court, this is the people who did it, and your back is exposed. Now, you have been exposed for the last year to a lot of information saying that Donald Trump is either a dupe of or in collusion with Russians and Vladimir Putin. The substance of that report is this. By going through billions of email, of Facebook and Twitters, Mueller's investigation found one agency that spent $100,000 telling Americans that Russia was pretty good and that Vladimir Putin was a good guy. They spent about 100,000. I don't know how many millions. I suspect it was in the area of hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of dollars were spent on the election. But I don't know that with certainty. But $100,000 was spent paying 80 Russian geeks to write this kind of information. The person who was paying them started out as a small entrepreneur and gained some benefit by the Russian government giving him the contract to provide food for a number of Russian schools. And that person is called Putin's chef because Putin has entertained some parties at his restaurant in St. Petersburg on a number of occasions. So he's not one of the golden oligarchs. He's not one of the 7 fabulously wealthy oligarchs, but he's done well in the New World Russia. And he pays his tithe to the Russian government by supporting Putin's current administration. He's no more a KGB agent than I am a CIA agent, but admittedly he was supportive of Putin's program. The long and short of this is that you have a minuscule wealthy private party doing what he can to counteract anti-Russian propaganda in the United States. He started long before the election of 2016. He started back about 2012 during Obama's second administration when the anti-Russian propaganda in the United States started becoming really vicious. In 2014, when the anti-Russian propaganda got to be, if not white hot, certainly bluish white hot, with the Russian acceptance of the Crimea back into the Russian Federation, it was at that time that he started making this supporter of the propaganda campaign started making political statements. Up until that time, they were primarily statements about how good Russia is, how good Putin is. About the time of the Kiev coup d'etat and Crimea getting back into the Russian Federation, this person started having his trolls introduce little comments about Trump or this politician or that politician. Anybody here remember The Mouse That Roared?
The movie?
The movie.
Peter
Yeah.
Sellers, yeah.
Yeah. Those of you who don't, it's about the leader of a very small country in Europe who decided that the only way to finance his government was to attack the United States. Because by attacking the United States, they would be beaten by the United States, and then the United States would pour all kinds of money into the country, rebuilding it. And it made a very good movie, and it made a very good point. The other side, the other movie that makes a similar point is Wag the Dog. What we have in this Russiagate story is a Wag the Dog story. The people who want to convict Donald Trump of collusion with the Russians and the people who want to paint Russia in the worst possible light have gone digging around the internet. Billions of emails and billions of Facebook pages looking for whatever they can find, and once they find something that looks like it's hostile to the American program, hoping and praying that they can find it was written by a Russian. And they did. So you got to Wag the Dog and the Mouse That Roared, and the people who are managing this, whether we're talking about Mueller or the New Yorker writers, Or my favorite person to dislike on NPR, something like I Stitch, something like that. And I apologize. Anyway, some of these so-called journalists are more irritating than others. But all of the journalists sound like the kids in Lord of the Flies who have gone absolutely wild without any adult supervision. My long and short message is, you've got a bunch of journalists pretending to be adults, and they still need their noses wiped. Sorry about that. Questions or comments? Tom?
The metaphor that I like to use is professional wrestling. You have two sides that are observing a certain script.
Yeah, that's a good metaphor as well. Professional wrestlers. I assume there are a whole lot of other similar. Almost everyone recognizes that professional wrestling is that way. I'm confident that the vast majority of Americans do not yet recognize that their political system works that way. And yet Carol Quigley told them,
Exactly.
back in the 1960s, Quigley wrote that the ruling elites want a two-party system because they can elect, they can throw the bums out every 4 years without ever changing whatever policies are actually important. Now, I'll point out, since we've got this little segment, the departments that are important in a major financial and political sense are the State Department and the Treasury Department and the Defense Department. Those are the departments that spend the most money and have the most influence internationally in terms of where the money is spent. Now, that's not to say that the DEA and Housing and Urban Development and these other departments aren't important. They spend money, they reward their friends, they punish their enemies. You have a revolving door at the Center for Disease Control. You have a revolving door in the Department of Agriculture. But these revolving doors are small compared to the revolving door in the Department of State, the Department of the Treasury, and the Federal Reserve Bank, and the Department of Defense. Indeed, Donald Trump did not have to go to generals at the Pentagon for his cabinet. He simply went to the State Department and picked his new cabinet. But you've got a revolving door that is self-replicating, which is really dangerous. Further comments? Because I've got a couple things to say about false science after that. Go ahead.
There's something about Robert Mueller. He has a long history in American government, and there's a lawsuit that has been brought against him. I think it's in federal court. It was brought by an FBI agent, one of the surviving FBI agents that survived the 9/11 thing, and it's Mueller is being charged with the cover-up of 9/11, and also I think maybe involved with some murders to people who were some FBI agents who were attempting to give the American people information about what was really happening.
And who's being tried? Who is?
Well, nobody's being tried. It's a lawsuit that has been brought against Robert Mueller, who
Oh,
was the FBI.
I refuse to call him Mueller. He's
during-
Mueller, but okay, I'll grant him.
Mueller, whatever.
I know.
But he was the FBI director when 9/11. He was instrumental in covering up what really happened.
I hope that goes to court. I hope a movie is made out of it. The most important step in public education with respect to the JFK assassination was Oliver Stone's movie. Now, the jury decided that there wasn't a conspiracy to assassinate John F. Kennedy. The jury members were persuaded by the evidence that was brought by the New Orleans prosecutor. They simply weren't convinced that the particular person charged was involved in that conspiracy. The problem we face as an American citizenry is that if something isn't advertised in our media, it hasn't happened. Oliver Stone's movie was panned a year before it was exposed to the public. And that's what happens to useful information, which is why places like NewsBud and Information Clearinghouse are so important. Anita?
I think you raised a really good point about how the media dominates.
Didn't wear my hearing aids there.
The point about how the media dominates the narrative, I think, is really something I'm really interested in. And but my question is, like, how do we, like, this fourth estate? You know, it is an estate. It is an apparatus of this particular
Yes.
state. How do we have all these other narratives, these contesting narratives, like the ones that you were just outlining. So, you know, if we want to be useful in changing the conversation, what do you suggest? You know, ordinary citizens have a role.
Feel impotent.
No,
in
wait, let me
the
finish.
political sense.
Ordinary citizens have a role to play
Absolutely.
in changing this conversation.
Absolutely.
So what do you suggest?
I suggest getting as many people together, and I would like to see, and I would participate in, I would like to see Veterans for Peace, not marching along the side of the road, but for 15 minutes, stop traffic and get the attention of the Iowa City Press Citizen. Stop it long enough so that people are irritated like blazes, but not long enough to get arrested. I don't care if they're get arrested for that matter. There's a story during World War I during the Civil War, about one of the objectors up to the Civil War being imprisoned, and his friend coming and asking him, "What are you doing in there?" And his friend said, "What are you doing out there?" Very valid question. But civil disobedience in a graded form is the only way, in my opinion, that we're going to get the attention of the media and subsequently to the ruling elites.
But the media itself is not really, you know, like, I agree that we need to interrupt the narrative. However, you're calling into question the standards of this institution whose attention we're seeking. So why would we entrust them with this narrative?
We're not entrusting them. We're showing them that there's an alternative narrative precisely by interrupting the commerce of Iowa City.
I'm with you on that one.
That's what you're doing. You irritate the public enough so that the public says, "Oh, something's going on." Exactly what the kids in the 1968 through 70s period did. They got the attention of the Iowa Cityans, they got the attention of Iowans, they got the attention of the citizens of the United States, saying we're sick and tired of war.
So what do you do with that attention?
What the Occupy movement attempted to do. The Occupy movement attempted to translate civil disobedience into a political program. Now they were quashed before.
They did, and you can see the lasting effects of that.
Yeah, you can see the very fact that the 99%, that resonates with the public
Yeah.
in a sense that it didn't before the Occupy movement. Will we accomplish it in a day or a week or a month or a year? No. But if we don't start, we certainly won't finish.
Okay.
But I think the Veterans for Peace would be a great place to start, but so far I haven't made a dent in them.
No, the
Tom.
grannies are doing the,
Pardon?
they've got a fund, so the grannies for their different things, so that they have been arrested, and they, you know, the idea of laying down in front of the bulldozers and everything, they have a fund to encourage that. So
Good.
they're one group that are willing to be arrested, supposedly.
Even if some other questions are uncomfortable for them.
Yeah,
I think there's three things that you can do that are probably the most powerful things that I've been able to do. First thing, turn off your TV.
Agreed.
Second thing, turn off the radio. Third thing is start your own blog and connect with other people and bypass the mainstream media so that we don't need those people anymore because we know that they're all lying. So what we need to do is connect between us on social media. And some of them are, Twitter, Facebook, some of those things are still corporate owned, or not corporate owned, but they're
Corporate
owned by the
managed.
new state. So that's my opinion.
I agree that we should minimize the lies, because we get inundated with it and we don't know what to believe. And that level of shock and awe that comes from being barraged with lies, it really is, I think we should minimize it. But I don't think we can afford to ignore the conversation entirely. I think we have to engage that conversation because we have to find out how, and I'm still working on this like so many others are, we have to find out how to create avenues for communication outside of the dominant narrative that are legitimated and reinvent the standards of the fourth estate. We cannot concede the fourth estate to the powers that be. We have to actually reclaim it. And I think some of our activism and some of our exertion should be directed towards accountability from those institutions and questioning the privatization of information that's supposed to be, because we know it's owned by private people. We should be questioning the ownership of that conduit of information and how to recreate standards that democratize it.
That battle, I am sorry to tell you, was lost under Bill Clinton.
It's not over.
Well, I see the fighter on the floor and not getting up. Because the media, let me put it this way, and as an addition, I think it is our responsibility to the extent that we can do so, we can support alternative media, which I do. I am absolutely disgusted, however, at the point, to the extent to which a number of the outlets that have purported to be alternative media, for example, The Nation or Mother Jones, have actually proven to be owned and operated by the ruling elites. Places like Information Clearinghouse, NewsBud, UNS.com, I've got about a dozen websites that provide useful information that is essentially uncorrupted. But truthout.org, to a lesser extent Dissident Voice, when an alternative news outlet started adopting the identity politics a couple of years ago, I said, you're part of the establishment, you're not part of the thinking alternative media. Because identity politics is the tool that is being used to keep you and me and Russ and Janet and Tom, etc., separate from one another.
Agreed, but I feel like, there is no Archimedean point. There's no objective position from which we can decide which media we should listen to and which ones we shouldn't. I think there are elements of truth in some of the ones that you just listed. And I also think that the real goal for people who need to be contesting the elites is that they can use critical analysis no matter what they're reading. So if they're reading the most conservative rag, they know how to read between the lines there. If they're reading one of the ones that you support, they know how to read between the lines there, because we have reasons to question the whole spectrum. We should not take anything at face value. We should be able to offer critical, engagement
That's
with
where I
that.
agree with you, and it's one of the aspects of what I'm trying to do here, and actually the people participating. The goal is not to take what I say as gospel. The goal is to take what I take and measure it against what you already know and what about the sources you already read. You need to know not only what the source is saying, how is the source biased, and what is the source against in both positive and negative directions. That requires critical thought. The American citizenry, several generations ago, and in a diminishing fashion, has lost the ability to critically evaluate.
Not all of us.
Pardon?
Some of us, not all of us.
Well, what I said was a generalization, I fully admit that.
Well, I appreciate I would love to see the list that you use. I read Truth Out all the time, and I think that it's very valid. I think I get a lot from reading Truth Out. So I would love to see your list. I mean, so, you know, it's...
Truth Out may still be on it, because and I'm not saying, one of the keys, and I don't know whether this applies to Truth Out or not, one of the keys of feeding you poison is to put it inside a sandwich of really good salami or really good roast beef. Because the best place to hide a lie is in a sandwich of 5 truths.
I feel that. And I don't read Truth Out uncritically. I think you have to read everything.
Absolutely. On that score, I'll be in perfect agreement with you.
Anyways, I've taken enough
Okay.
space.
What I have there, the good news, this is the second section, and it will be relatively brief, Dawn. Last week I said we were dealing with fake news and history, and this week I was going to deal with fake science. And as I went through it, I was delighted to find out that there is relatively little fake science. In this group, we have dealt with fluoride as an additive to toothpaste and found out that it's a very bad idea, and that its commercial origins lie in the fact that fluoride was a waste product in the production of aluminum. It also happens to be a waste product of the Manhattan Project. It's very useful that uranium hexafluoride. Fluorine has the relatively unique characteristic of being of one molecular weight, of one atomic weight. The vast majority of other substances in the periodic table have several different isotopes, meaning they have a different number of neutrons in their nuclei. Fluorine happens to have a single number, one number, I don't recall what it is, I suspect it's about 12, but I'm not sure in all candor. But fluorine exists as one type of atom. So that when you mix 6 fluorine atoms with uranium-235 or 238, it makes 2 different size molecules. Because the fluorine is all the same size, and you've got 2 different sizes of uranium atom. So that's very useful for pushing it under high pressure through a small molecular sieve, and the U-238 goes through slowly, and the U-235 goes through a little faster. Likewise, it can be used for the same process in an ultracentrifuge. Fluorine entered our environment both through the Manhattan Project and through the manufacture of aluminum, and the manufacturers of aluminum and the byproduct of the Manhattan Project, they needed to dispose of the fluorine one way or another. So fluorine chemistry was advanced substantially in the 1940s and early 1950s. The people, especially who made aluminum, needed to find a way of getting rid of the fluorine, of the fluoride that was generated by it. They said, you know, if we can find a way of selling it, that's a whole lot better off than if we have to pay for the disposition of a toxic waste. We found a way by convincing dentists that it was helpful for the teeth. As a matter of fact, it was found to be in higher quantities, most unhealthy for teeth in late 19th century Germany. Doesn't matter. By reducing the amount and by reselling it, they were able to sell it to toothpaste manufacturers. Interestingly enough, very recently, the recommended amount of fluoride to be introduced into water has been reduced from 4 parts per million down to 1 part. You would have thought that that would have been known decades ago if the real measurement was to find out how much you should put in to make teeth healthy. But that's another matter. there is a relatively benign but philosophical type of false or fake science. And that is, and I'm going to refer to two scientists. Now I'm going to pick this up again because I'm going to need this as a cheat sheet. But a scientist by the name of Sheldrake has attacked science as an ideology. And the Nobel scientist who has called global warming a new type of science, or a new type of religion rather, attacks it on the same principle. Sheldrake attacks science as an ideology because it says it has closed itself off by becoming a religion. It is a religion in the sense that it has defined reality. It has defined reality as being mechanistic. That is, everything that happens because of a specific physical mechanism. That matter as it exists, matter and energy as they exist, are unconscious. They do not function in a conscious, they do not function in a sentient sense. That the laws of nature have been fixed from the Big Bang to the Big Crunch. The laws of nature don't change. This is religion. Another element of this religion is that nature is purposeless, that it does not have a goal. Now it's kind of redundant to say it does not have a goal in mind since nature doesn't have a mind. But it's important of these three, and I'm going to go through the others that Sheldrake mentions. All of these are assertions that are not subject to scientific refutation or confirmation. These are assertions that a scientist is asked to accept if that scientist accepts science as an ideology. Now, I am a scientist in the sense of using the scientific method to arrive at certain answers for very specific questions. As a methodology, science is really great. As a religion, it is every bit as subject to accusation and attack as any other religion. Now, what do I mean? Science says that a carefully conducted experiment reproducing exactly the conditions of the previous experiment. Now, notice those conditions. Reproducing exactly the conditions of the previous experiment, that the outcome of experiment 2 is going to be the same as experiment 1. That's a basic assumption of the scientific method. And as a basic assumption, it's very, very good. If I conduct an experiment, if I conduct the Galileo experiment and drop a feather, or better, a small pebble and a cannonball from the Tower of Pisa, if I drop it once, they're going to get to the ground at the same time. If I drop it 100 times, the cannonball and this pebble are going to get to the ground at the same time. If I reproduce the conditions, I'm going to reproduce the result. Now, and that is as a method. Let me suggest to you what would have happened about 1850. I'm picking the date on purpose. If somebody had, for whatever curious reason, constructed a crystal radio, the earliest, most primitive radios, consisting of an inductive coil and a capacitor and a pair of headphones and an antenna. If they had constructed it, time travel, somebody left one on the table, and put the headphones on, and a lightning bolt hit outside, they would not only hear the lightning bolt with their ears, they would have heard the static from the lightning bolt through their headphones. Where did that sound come from? It did come from the lightning bolt. Why did that sound come through the headphones when the lightning bolt was out there? there was a source of energy that would have been totally mysterious to that listener in 1850. It would have been defined by science as a religion. It would have been, someone would say, you didn't hear anything from the headphones. It couldn't have happened because there's no law of science saying that describing or explaining how it could have happened. And if it couldn't have happened, obviously it didn't happen to you. As a scientific method, observation and reproduction of experimentation is great. As a religion saying what is and is not possible, science is every bit as faulty as, what is that religion? Scientism. One of the implications of materialism, that is, matter and energy are not sentient, they do not have awareness, is that your thinking and my thinking is contained within our skulls. It is the result of the firing of neurons inside your cranium. It doesn't happen outside. And if you have the illusion of an out-of-body experience, all of that has happened inside your head, not out there. Memory is contained between your ears. It doesn't exist out there. These are all the results of what is called materialism. It is a philosophy that the only thing that exists is material. And energy, by the way, is just matter in another form. Matter is convertible into energy, and energy is convertible into matter. So there's no fundamental distinction between energy and matter. That means that if psychic phenomena of any sort is observed, for example, I will use as an example of psychic phenomena. It's not psychic phenomena, but I'll use it for illustrative purposes. The first person who observed entanglement of particles had a problem explaining why that alpha particle over there is matched by a beta particle over there. Far separated by space, one particle determines the type of particle the other one is. That's known as entanglement in nuclear physics. It does exist, and it frustrated Albert Einstein like all blazes. As far as Einstein was concerned, it couldn't be. It was simply the fact that you didn't know what it was. But it always was that kind of particle and that kind of particle. It took a really brilliant, young theoretical physicist to come up with an experiment to demonstrate that entanglement did exist, and that the identity of particle A was not determined until somebody observed the identity of particle B. And I applaud that young theoretical physicist because that was a marvelous experiment that was really genius.
Who was it?
The name of the guy, I don't recall. I can find out, but I don't recall. He made his reputation. He was a grad student at the time, and yeah.
That's cool, I was just
Yeah,
curious.
it was really marvelous. This is fake science, though. The identity, the assertion that the only thing that is real is inanimate matter or non-sentient energy, same thing. And that our experience is purposeless because nature is purposeless. That is a religion that is not subject. Yeah, if you accept it as a religion, you're not going to create any experiment to test its legitimacy or not. And Sheldrake says, you know what? There are dogs who know when their master is coming home? Do they have a good sense of time? Unless you create the experiment, as the young grad student did, you're not going to find that source of alternative energy that was evident in the lightning bolt in 1850. If you close what is possible, you reduce human beings to 2 dimensions, exactly what our educational system has done. Our educational system has intentionally worked to destroy the creativity of the individual student so that they are all a manageable, uniform product to act as consumers. Well, that has implications for science, it has implications for culture, it has implications for your development as a human being, and frankly, it has implications for our survival as a society. Because if you believe that your life is without purpose and that the only purpose that you have is to consume, your behavior is going to be different than if you believe your actions affect Demita, and Demita's actions affect Aaron, and Aaron's actions affect Tom. So there is fake science, and a whole lot of scientists, in order to get their grants, have signed up for it, because they won't do. The person who does an experiment on marijuana as a beneficial adjunct to medicine, up until very recently, had a real hard time getting his or her grant proposal funded. Thank you.